Hi, everyone. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan, and welcome to the Times of Israel's Behind the Headlines series. We have today with us Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove, who is the head rabbi of Park Avenue Synagogue since 2008. I reached out to Elliot because I noted a couple sermons that he recently gave. They're kind of bookend sermons. One is called Let There Be Disruption, which ironically happened right before the coronavirus really took off in the States, and the other, Let There Be Reconstructing. So first of all, thank you, Elliot, for joining me today.
Amanda, thank you. It's great to be here.
Pleasure. I also want to publicly thank you for 2 years ago when we met in a Starbucks cafe in Pittsburgh in Squirrel Hill. I had just finished reporting on one of the many funerals that I'd been covering, and I was actually quite distraught. So your words of comfort meant a lot and let me continue on with the coverage of bringing and amplifying the voices and the people of Squirrel Hill to the world. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I will always remember that conversation. This is actually the time of year, always, but especially this moment, that we think about the horrific events of Pittsburgh, and you and I were both there mourning together. So it's good to reconnect, and it's always important to remember.
100%. So to the matter at hand, just a very modest proposition of reimagining the American Jewish community, essentially, is what you've been proposing in your sermons and in your forward articles. So in your first one, which again, ironically happened right before the coronavirus really took off, you were actually in the synagogue delivering a sermon to a congregation. Wow, who remembers that? And you were talking about some innovative congregations that had been taking place earlier in American Jewish history. Can you say a few words about that particular sermon?
Yeah, the irony of that is that I was looking for innovative disruption prior to COVID actually taking place. There was a great Harvard business professor named Clayton Christensen who termed the phrase, in the sense that we remember there was a moment when there was Blockbuster Video, now there's Netflix. We remember prior to digital, there was Kodak Film. There are all sorts of industries, some of whom have transformed, some of whom unfortunately have not. And the Chabura movement, other transformations of American Jewish life are moments where there has been adaptation along the way. And my argument was, prior to COVID, that the Jewish community needed to learn how to adapt and transform itself in changing times. The bitter irony, difficult irony otherwise, is that about 2 weeks after I gave that sermon, COVID hit. And what I say in shorthand is the toothpaste came out of the tube. So the conversations that we were having in an abstract way and speaking about what the necessary changes that the Jewish community must confront, and we can go into that in the interview, from content to membership models to financial structures, how communities come together, our hand has been forced by way of the events of the last now 8 months. And so on the high holidays, I sort of put that conversation to the fore of my community.
Your high holiday sermon was really fascinating because it was such a great historical look back at many different periods in terms of Jewish history in which Judaism has essentially reinvented itself. I remember when we began reading Masechet Brachot recently, the teacher of our little community Talmud class said, basically, this is a way for Jews to become Jews. This is when the destruction of the temple happened. They had to scramble and put something together. And in your sermon, you were talking about Mordechai Kaplan's vision during the Great Depression, which was a disastrous time for people personally and congregations generally. Talk a little bit about what happened to him and how he decided to take things forward.
Mordechai Kaplan is a particularly instructive moment of reconstruction of Jewish life, in this case of American Jewish life, in a sense no different than following the Spanish expulsion, no different than any other moment of economic, physical, spiritual deprivation, because it was a tough time, as you note, to put it mildly, the time of the Great Depression. Now, Kaplan's career had preceded that moment. He himself had recommendations for the necessary changes of American Jewish life. And if you were to tell the story of the last 100 years of American Jewry, whether or not you're Reconstructionists or not, it's fair to say that Mordechai Kaplan's, Rabbi Kaplan's fingerprints are everywhere. The JCC movement, the Chavurah movement, the notion of synagogues with these large campuses, and some with swimming pools, some with basketball courts, some with big gymnasiums. This was a transformation from the Stiebel model of just a small prayer house of Eastern and Central European Jewry when they immigrated over, not just geographically, but culturally, linguistically, and otherwise onto American shores. And so Kaplan wrote at the behest of a essay contest. It's a great story. It's a great story. And he finally, he was 48 years old, and he took his ideas and he created a volume called Judaism as a Civilization, which Professor Chassia Diner once noted, to the degree that there's an American Bible or a Bible of American Judaism, this is it. And he lays out a vision. And my contention was that vision of the last 90 years has really shaped American Jewish life. And it is with extraordinary gratitude and we all have to Rabbi Kaplan. And now it's time for a new vision.
The idea of a shul with a pool and a school, perhaps in America, is not something that's as tenable, but I live in Israel, that this is something that is so central to our lives as communities today. So it's perhaps likely that American Jewry needs a new vision, but it could be that Israeli Jewry needs to even more adopt the Kaplan vision. Now, you were talking about in that sermon as well of the idea that much of American Jewry just doesn't even know how to perform the mitzvot that Kaplan, who actually grew up Orthodox and then slowly evolved into whatever he labeled himself later on in life. And I think it wasn't Reconstructionist, if I'm not mistaken. I don't think he ever called himself that. But he grew up Orthodox. He was so entrenched in the tradition, in the rabbinic tradition, that he was able to take another step forward. Do you see that being the case today, where 7 million odd Jews in America, the large majority are not grounded in the tradition of rabbinic Judaism anymore at all?
I think you're right. I think at the beginning of Kaplan's career, he never wanted to start another movement. He was not an ideologue in the sense of creating, he functioned within the conservative movement for much of his career as a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Eventually he branched out, but that was only much later in his career. And I think that Kaplan's vision of mitzvot was he understood that for his moment of American Jewry, that the language of a mitzvah as a commanded action in a supernatural sense of a performance of the divine will was not a language that was speaking to his moment in those 1930s of American Jewry. I do think that right now, American Jewry, and this is just my anecdotal reflections on the last 20 odd years of being a rabbi serving American Jewry, I think that American Jews are spiritually thirsty. I think people want a language of ritual. People want to ask certain ultimate questions, and they want to know how to make their lives sacred in true theological terms. What is it, as the prophet asks, that the Lord asks of me? I think these questions are not going anywhere. I think the questions of connecting to communities of meaning, of creating a sacred schedule of our week, of our month, of our year, people want this more, not less. The problem, Amanda, is that we are the most secularly educated generation, perhaps ever, and yet the very language of ritual is foreign to us. We don't know how to open up a siddur, to daven, to say brachot. I'm reminded of the great story that's told when Theodore Herzl went to the first Zionist Congress, and he was speaking to all of the luminaries and creating his bold vision, but he knew he was going to, this is in his diaries, he knew he was going to be called up to the Torah at the local synagogue. And in his diaries, he says he was more nervous about that moment of saying the bracha, the blessing, than he was about whatever the agenda of the first Zionist Congress was. That's American Jewry right now. We want to be engaged with mitzvot. We actually observe 1 million secular mitzvot. We eat all sorts of odd foods and regiment our time, and we live according to a certain calendar, but we don't have the tools to access the Jewish mitzvot. We have mitzvot, they're just not the Jewish ones.
I know so many people who perform the mitzvah of recycling, for instance, and other things that are helpful to the world. But what are some ways that we can reach out to the Instagram generation in order to bring them perhaps more into the fold and have the opportunity to live both a full American Jewish modern life and a Jewish life?
So you're asking a lot of questions. They're all good ones, and they're all connected. I think any way we can bring Jews closer to contemporary, to Jewish life, the better. We should all compete with each other actively and delightfully and fight for every Jewish soul. The question about the retrieving a language of mitzvot in the context of this moment, I think, is exactly to the point. Right? People are engaging online. There are Instagram feeds, there are Peloton bikes, there are SoulCycle bikes. There are ways that people are accessing information from their phones in ways that we never have before. And so whether or not it's monitoring what we eat, whether or not it's our exercise patterns, our sleep patterns, or otherwise, I think to this question of reconstructing Jewish life, I think if we can adapt the ideals of Jewish life to the technology of today, I think that's the charge of this moment, Amanda. I think, and I think it's there. I think it's there. The Jewish world needs to catch up with the Peloton world.
So for you personally, I noted that your sermons are online and several other activities that your synagogue, which I should also say has been around in various forms since 1882, first as a Reform synagogue and since Milton Steinberg as a conservative synagogue, and is bursting at the seams, according to witness testimony from a year ago when before everything happened, that you're just really thriving. But now everything is closed down and you've gone online. What are you seeing? Are you still finding engagement? Are you able to even bring more people through your virtual door?
Yes, yes. This moment is a moment of tremendous challenge. It's also a moment of tremendous opportunity. I think, actually, I know, as any North American, any congregational rabbi will say, the challenge is at every synagogue, the Hebrew word is a Beit Knesset. It's a place of gathering. And so right now our hands are tied totally behind our backs because all of the things that we would normally do as a community center, as a house of worship, and otherwise we cannot do all together. And that is deeply challenging and troubling because that's what a shul is, a place that you can gather together. We at Park Avenue Synagogue and a few other synagogues as well have transformed from our physical campus to a digital campus. We had on our high holidays tens of thousands of viewers from not just our community, not just the country, but all over the world engaging with us on the high holidays. We had the prayer book as a PDF on our website. And the numbers were astounding. They were very affirming. A tremendous amount of work went into it. It reflected the hopes of the community, of the world Jewish community, to engage with Jewish content. And we have been asking ourselves that question because it's not just localized on the high holidays. It's also, my post-Minyan class. I'm doing a read through Tanakh through the year. It's a small, modest, typical rabbinic class that maybe last year I would get 10 to 20 people. I have over 120 people now studying post-Minyan.
Astounding. That's really testimony.
Sort of
it's astounding. Yep.
A Perek Yomi. And I can give you our lecture series, our programs, our daily Minyan, and otherwise, this sort of virtual campus has been created that ultimately, please God, a vaccine and prayer willing, when that moment comes soon, that we will re-enter our physical space. There will be not a physical, not a digital, but I've heard the word phygital world that emerges, that we are both a traditional synagogue where people are greeting each other and davening and building community and in a class, but also a digital presence, which is going to beg new questions. What does it mean to be a non-resident member of a synagogue? What are the economic models that are sustainable for synagogues? Why would I join Park Avenue Synagogue if I can sit at home in my pajamas and watch Shabbos morning services? What are the goods and services that the synagogue needs to provide its membership? And what are the asks of the person? It's no different than the Times of Israel. The Times of Israel has an online content. You can also join the Times of Israel community for a small fee. Please do. And so you yourself are wrestling with this question of how to provide content. It's crass for a synagogue to say it, but what's the, how do you monetize it so you can pay your employees and create a sustainable model? But also, so these are all fascinating questions. And let me tell you, they don't teach us any of this in rabbinical school. This is all figuring it out as we go.
And for journalism as well, just to add, anything I may have learned in school is irrelevant within 2 or 3 years. So we're figuring it all out together as the world adapts and changes. Now, you mentioned the economic model, and you're in a very well-heeled community. But I would have to say that for many of the Jews that I know in America, the idea of joining a synagogue is problematic, mostly because of the financial commitment. And I'm talking about, artists and journalists and people of the community. And I do wonder how you as a rabbi feel about providing the goods and services to people who can't afford to really pay you for them, as it were.
My personal wiring is I work tirelessly to make sure that whether it's a struggling family within my community or otherwise, both in the synagogue and beyond the synagogue, to make Jewish life available, community learning, Jewish camping, all of the goods and services. I think that no question on the Upper East Side, I'm living in a bubble. And I think that living in that bubble demands that those in my orbit step up to a leadership challenge of Jewish life, that we leverage our blessings towards making Jewish education, Jewish life available internally and externally. So that's very much a mission of my career. I didn't ask for it, but I know the bubble in which I live, and with that bubble comes great responsibility. And so the question of providing for others, I think there needs to be really creative and collaborative thinking. I'm not existentially worried, about the large urban synagogues like my own. What I'm worried about are small suburban synagogues who were struggling already prior to COVID. Amanda, when we met at Pittsburgh, Tree of Life, as we know, because there were 3 minyanim there that morning, all renting space in some way, that was a struggling synagogue prior to that horrific day in Pittsburgh. They were begging, borrowing, and stealing just to keep the lights on. So what does it mean for hundreds of communities like that at this time? And so what would it look like? I think the national umbrella organizations need to look very hard at this moment. So if there is an event for an election or a book club or a memorial, a Yom HaAtzmaut program, whatever it might be, what would it look like for there to be collaboration across different synagogues? So that small synagogue in Pittsburgh, that small synagogue in Milwaukee, in Long Island, can all resource together and live stream, sort of like how local news works with national news, where they say, now we're going to the weather locally. What would it look like for that local, global, or people call it glocal model? So you're because I don't want to be the Walmart of the synagogue business. I'm a shul guy. I want that community in Pittsburgh and Milwaukee to thrive. And I want the members of the Pittsburgh community to, if they want to join me on a Shabbos, fine, but I want them to be dues paying, capital campaign giving, proud members of their local synagogues. So I feel very strongly about that.
It's such an interesting time period. I look outside my home on Shabbat, and we have any number of street minyanim. Even before COVID, we didn't necessarily have so many, paid rabbis in my community. But now I see on every street corner a different group of prayer people coming together, men in the case of where I live. And I just wonder if the idea of this massive shul, the massive synagogue is somewhat passé after having experienced such really, it's like chamber music versus going to the symphony. After you hear Brahms, in a small room in small intimate setting, do you really want to go to the symphony and be overloaded with Beethoven or whatever? I suppose what's important is to maintain the ability to choose the place and venue, but it's a real question, I think, for many, many Americans who are priced out of Judaism, be it through the synagogue dues, and all of these things have traditionally been what have created, molded, and maintained American Judaism. And I just wonder, is it time perhaps to say, okay, let's find something else, which you are saying yourself through the idea of the toothpaste has already come out of the tube. But beyond going online, is there anything else that you feel that your community or other communities can do in this era?
On the specific question of pricing
and just maintaining a Jewish community without having it necessarily to be based in
I think institution. So those are two separate questions.
Okay.
What is the future of large institutional life versus, chamber music versus a symphony? What is Park Avenue Synagogue versus a small shtibel? Okay. I believe that there is a place for both. I don't believe that people are wired any one way. I think these small communities will continue to thrive. And I think there is a place for the large communities to also, we can offer goods and services and a sense of community and gathering that is very different. I'm not saying better or worse, than a small community model. There's room enough in the ecosystem of Jewish life for both. And I think our community, for one, seeks to do both. So you have a large community, but within that community, you have a variety of sub-communities, whether that's a Hebrew school community, the early childhood, the men's club, the women's network, a chavurah that meets every Shabbos morning, right? There are sub-communities within the Park Avenue family, and many synagogues, if not most large synagogues, work that way. I think that as long as human beings are human, we are going to want human connection. And so for all of my hopes and dreams about a digital platform and taking the content and delivering it virtually, I think I have great confidence, and I hope I'm not wrong, that, and I know I have biases, but I think that when people can safely re-enter small or large prayer spaces, we will, and we will in droves, because that feeling of seeing people on a Shabbos morning, of raising your children side by side with others, celebrating life's joys and mourning life's sorrows, that's not going anywhere. That's not going anywhere. And so I'm very excited about that. The other question you're asking is so important and so painful, because and precedes COVID. Whether because of its camping, if it's the cost of day school education, the cost of synagogue membership, if you add up that bundle of goods that we preach as rabbis and Jewish educators that define a Jewish life, and you put a price tag, you and I both know, Amanda, that for the vast majority of American Jews, that price tag is beyond the reach. And that's before an economic crisis. And so I think that those questions, whether it's working with the UJA federations, whether it is reconsidering models of financial sustainability, I have to tell you, I am of two minds about this. I'm married to a Jewish educator, and I want every teacher in every Jewish day school to get paid as much money as humanly possible. It is terrible. If you saw how hard Jewish educators are working right now, whatever they are getting paid is not enough, is not enough. And as the leader of a Jewish institution, I know that if I pay Jewish educators what they actually deserve, then my families will not be able to enroll their children because it'll be financially out of reach. So are you identifying a problem? Yes. Is there an easy solution? No. But I think great minds need to work collaboratively at long-term systemic solutions.
Yeah, our time is drawing short, and we're just ahead of an amazingly polarized election. I wonder how you, in your wonderful rabbi role, can give us some words of comfort, as you did to me 2 years ago, and it was so important. In this time of huge unrest in America, among the Jews, among the general population, how can we still maintain civil conversation, still maintain our friendships, even in this very, very, very fractured, polarized era?
This fall, we have a confluence of many events that point to the toxic nature of our civil discourse right now. In Israel, the observance this fall of 25 years since Rabin's assassination. In America, a divisive political season. In you and I will always be connected by the anniversary of the Pittsburgh shooting. We can look in a number of places in America and in Israel. I am often comforted by the model of Hillel and Shammai in the Talmud to dialogue partners, two houses, each representing a different position, strenuously disagreeing one with the other. And as we know that Hillel's views were accepted more often than not because he was more right at any time, but the nature of his stating his argument, he always stated Shammai's argument before him. And I think that in there's a antidote to our present political culture, meaning I don't need to agree with you, Amanda, nor you with me, but we need to understand where each other are coming from, and we need to be able to put ourselves in each other's shoes and acknowledge the humanity of the other. And I think that the ill of our era is that we are not willing to try to understand the other. And so I think that is a very healthy model from our own tradition that could inform this moment.
Thank you so much for your time and your words of wisdom. I think this is a conversation to be continued, really. So I look forward to that. And thank you again.
Well, thank you, Amanda. I am a proud member of the Times of Israel community, and I love the Times of Israel, and I'm honored to be part of this conversation. Toda, toda. Thank you.
Bye-bye.